So Rook Endgames are very, very tricky. And they are for people at all levels. And I'd say the knowledge level varies a lot. So like there are some people who will know their basic endgames pretty well even when they were younger or like less experienced. Other people just don't learn them. And even though they become like 2000, 2200, even higher, they still don't know a lot of their basic endgames. But the nice thing about these endgames is that they can be studied at almost any level. So one of the things I'd say about like the endgames is that, okay, I mean, they're a little bit different. It's not as much, you know, a lot of the concern is about whether you're able to queen a pawn, something like this. But I'd say in Rook endgames, one of the most important things to remember is that if, it happens kind of for both sides, but especially for the side that does have the extra pawn, is whether your king has shelter. So do you guys know what I mean by this concept? If not, that's fine. Just let me know. Are you guys aware of this? Shelter? If you, I mean, a lot of people have heard of it. But the main thing is, if black keeps checking you, does your king have anywhere to hide? So in this position, believe it or not, so actually, I'm going to start with this position. Because this is the same position with black to move. And black can actually draw pretty simply here. And the way it happens is that black simply gives this check on a8. King has to move up. And black's just going to keep checking you. The problem you have is that the king has nowhere to hide. Now, you can't just check forever regardless, right? The king can try to approach the rook. But this is what will happen if first of all, if white tries to approach from here, it doesn't really work out, because after this check, can the king approach further? The pawn would hang. So the king can try to do it this way. But once the king gets a sufficient distance from the pawn, it becomes very easy to win. So here, or to draw, I should say. So here, black has a draw immediately. Anyone? Sorry? Do I have the wrong position? I don't think there's a knight anywhere.
I should.
I was like, whoa, what's going on with the screens? Rook f6?
Or e6.
E6, there we go. And then you're just going to collect this pawn, right? So you see how simple it is, actually. Like, if you don't have shelter for your king, it's really hard to win with the extra pawn. Because the problem is the rook can just keep checking you until your king has to go too far away. Like, if the king goes all the way down to d2, like, the likelihood of winning is pretty small, right? Because the pawn is simply not going to win by itself. So having shelter is extremely important. So going back to the first position, here white can create a little bit of shelter for himself. And that's actually how you win this position. It's a technique called building a bridge. So the way it works is you first of all give a check. This check is very important. Because if you don't, then again, you just don't have any place to hide with your king. So for example, if king f6, you actually can win immediately here. And note how the reason why this wins is because you actually have shelter now. This king shields your own king. And if the rook tries to check you, you can just queen. And the queen's unstoppable. I mean, black can try a trick like rook here threatening mate. Oh, no, it's not even mate. The rook can cover. So you can just get a queen, right? So the black king will usually just move away. Let's say here. And now, your goal, what's the difference between this position and the previous one? Can you guys figure it out?
F2.
F7?
Or F7.
It's OK. Yeah, so you have the f7 square, which is nice, because if the rook starts checking you from here, your king can escape. But here's my question. If black doesn't do much, so say, for example, if you play king f7 here, how are you going to win if I just keep checking you from the back? So you might be able to play something like king g8, but the rook can come back. It's not entirely clear. And if you try to come up, and the problem is you don't have shelter, right? Your king has nowhere to hide. So when you get to this position, you actually have to, thank you very much, you actually have to get your king shelter with a technique called building a bridge. I didn't make up this name, it's just what it's called. So what you start with is this move. Looks like a pretty harmless move, right? But the whole idea is that, like, let's say black passes a move, either with king 8. Let's say black just plays king h7. How do you think you win? All right. So you're threatening checkmate and to queen the pawn. By the way, it's the most forcing move for the guys at the previous lecture. Give it check, which is almost all of you. So what now? Got to come up, right? Otherwise, you're just going back. Now, what is this rook going to do for you? OK, but how does it block the check? So I'm going to give you a check now. Well, you can't let go of your pawn, right? Going back doesn't help you. So where else can you go? So here, for example. So now, if I give check here, what do? Where does the king hide? G5, I don't know, because then the rook comes back. But why did I put the rook here? It doesn't help block the check here, but if I move a little closer, so where can I move that's a little closer to the rook? There's only one square, right? I mean,
Thanks.
all right. Glad we got that one figured out. But what's the whole point? That after the check, you can do what now? Aha.
Dun, dun, dun.
There you go. And this is called building a bridge, and it's one of the main components in a rook endgame. Like, if someone's going to show you basic rook and pawn endgames, this is one of the first things you should get shown. So if you learn how to master this technique, that's already a major start in rook and pawn endgames, actually. So, so building a bridge, etc. However, one of the things I like to do in these positions, I'll notice like a lot of students will, for example, know this technique. But if I try to mess with them a little bit, all of a sudden they have lots of trouble winning. So one of the things I like people to do is get comfortable in these positions. Because there's often some little detail they don't know, or if their opponent doesn't follow the game plan, they have trouble winning. So for example, in this position, how do you guys win if I simply wait? This is a possibility that's often forgotten in the endgame. And it's possible to use it from both perspectives. For example, if you're on the defense, in a middle game, it's very rare you can just pass a move, right? Because your opponent can almost always play a move that improves their position. In the endgame, there are fewer pieces, right? So oftentimes, your opponent actually doesn't have a move that improves their position, at least significantly. So waiting is a very good technique, both if you're defending and if you're on offense. Because if you're on offense, sometimes your opponent has their pieces on the perfect defensive squares. So you just waste a move and you make them move one of their pieces. So this is a technique that's often forgotten about when people play endgames. So black's trying to defend just by saying, all right, how are you going to queen with your king on f6? You can play king f7, but then I'll start giving checks again. Rook endgames can be some of the most annoying things. Because like when the rooks just start giving you check and you don't have shelter, it's like you just, sometimes it prevents you from winning some really basic stuff.
So you bring your king one move forwards.
Remember though, your pawn, you have to hold on to your pawn. But you have the right idea. You need your rook to be a little closer to the king. Your king cannot move though. So what can move?
The rook king is one there.
Aha. And this is a very nice move. Because now, you're just going to shield with rook e5. And there's nothing black can do here. So for example, if king h6, you just play rook e5. If check, you hide here. And queen cannot be stopped. It's not as easy as it looks, right? But the thing is, once you get the hang of these things, once you learn these techniques really well, they actually become second nature. Like you can do it without thinking. But it takes a while. They look pretty unnatural, right? This isn't like normal chess. That's why like the endgame, you have to devote specific time to it just because it's so unlike any other part of the game. I mean, how often in the middle game are you going to be like running your king around in circles and putting your rook back and forth? It just doesn't happen. But in the endgame, I mean, it happens all the time. So okay, let's go back. So for example, one of the ways I'll mess with a student, for example, is say they play here. Because yeah, if the king is here, for example, playing rook here doesn't work because the king attacks the rook, right? You can't shield right away. So this is the magical square for the rook. But one of the things I'll do to students is I'll say, all right, I'll just attack it. What are you going to do now? You wouldn't believe how some of them flip out. They're like, wait, you can't attack my rook. It's not in the rules. So how do you win after king h5?
G7.
Rook g7? Okay. Because yeah, one of the things you want to do, if you face a move you don't know, and let's face it, when you're just starting out learning endgames, it's pretty much everything, right? You have to try to figure things out. So one of the ways you can figure it out is if your opponent does something, like for example, say you're in a position you know is winning, and they try something a little different. Oftentimes they might prevent the idea that often wins, but you want to be aware of other ideas that win besides the one you know. Like building the bridge, you guys know now, right? But they're trying to interfere with building the bridge. So you have to find another way to win. So yeah, rook g7 is a nice way to do it. And this will almost always work. So the idea is that if the king goes back to attack the rook, what do you do now? So, and now the problem is if the rook checks you here, you can shield with the rook. Again, shelter is the most important thing in these endgames. Black can try a trick. I can give you check here. And now what? Right. Do not queen, please, allowing rook takes check. It's a very painful when you have the win and you let it slip like this. It's happened to everyone. But yeah, do not let it happen.
Happened to you yesterday.
I'm sure it has. It's very easy to do. That's why you keep your guard up all the time. Even in the endgame, you know, most forcing moves, right? Okay, so king f7. And now there's no way to stop this queen. Like if black tries to wait, you can just play here. You know, it's quite easy to win once you have something like this. You know, where the rook is just trying, like hoping to try for one little tactic. All right. So, basic Lucina. So now I'm going to get a little bit more complicated and show you a few different things. All right. But a lot of them, if you know the Lucina, it actually gets... so yeah, this one I showed you. So if it was black to play, then it's a draw because of this check, right? The king is closer, so you can't hide on the f-file. So the check's from afar. However, one of the key checking distances. Now, memorization is really hard in chess, and I try to make it so people have to memorize as little as possible. Like memorizing that whole sequence is hard to do. So one of the ways I try to learn it is by learning by the ideas. So you learn the idea of building the bridge with the rook on the 4th, right? Or if you're black, the rook would be on the 5th, but you get what I mean, right? So you learn the technique with the bridge with the rook on the 4th. If the king approaches the rook, you bring the rook here and then bring the king here. So your rook and pawn shield your king. But one of the things I'd memorize is that when your opponent's giving checks with the rook from the side, in this particular situation, but even from the front sometimes, the key square that black needs is 5 squares. So you see how here black can play rook a8, and there are 3 squares in between the king and the rook. It's a 5 square total, right? That's how much black needs in order to have enough distance. Because here, black white cannot approach this way because there's one file too many in between the king and the rook. And the rook will always be able to get back. Let me show you what I mean. The next one, this position is actually a very easy win, even with black to move. The reason being that if black tries to give check, the rook is only 4 squares away. See that? And now you play here, you can't check along here anymore. You guys see that? So you'd have to go somewhere like along here, for example, and the king comes back and it's the queen. It's over, right? By the way, if I'm going too fast, if you're not following, if you have a question, just please let me know. If I'm skipping over everything, it's not always so useful, right? But okay, so you see how the 4 squares is not enough, but when you have 1 extra square, it makes all the difference. So counting how many squares there are between the rook and the king is actually something which is really useful. Okay, the next one I'm going to show you. So I showed you one of the key winning positions, which is called the Lucina position, where you have the king on the 8th, the pawn on the 7th, and you build the bridge. It's called the Lucina position. There was a guy named Lucina. They named it after him. So this one is called the Philidor. Now, there are about 1 million things named after Philidor in chess. Lucina, I think, is just the one position. With Philidor, there's tons of them. But in Rook Endgames, there's something called the Philidor Draw. Now, this is a technique you use to draw against the king in 1 pawn. Now, here you can see the king in 1 pawn is farther back. Your king is in front, which is the best place, right? You want your king to be able to blockade this pawn. And these situations are almost always drawn. However, it can get very tricky if your king gets forced out from in front of the pawn. But there's a way you can prevent white from doing this. So there's an immediate technique to draw. Do any of you know it, first of all? So if not, try to figure it out. Spend a couple minutes. Figure out how you can prevent. So I can tell you what white's idea is. White's idea is going to be to play something like king here. And then the idea is to be able to check you and force your king out. So how can you prevent white from accomplishing this?
Check.
You can give a check. It's a forcing move. You got to look at it. But I play king here, and now I'm threatening rook h8, which is pretty powerful. So the problem is now you almost never want a passive rook when you're defending. There are occasions where it's OK. But in general, if you're not sure, don't do it. Because the rook here actually loses immediately because I just play here. And this check is going to be deadly. You have to play here to avoid mate, and then I win your rook. So passive rook, again, that means a rook just on the back rank defending against mate, for example, that can't really move anywhere. Passive rook. Passive rooks in rook endings are death. You almost always want an active rook. So active means you're out from the side, you're trying to check, you're not just tied down to 1 square or 1 file. So rook a6 is an excellent move here. The point being that it cuts the king off. So there's no tricky moves like king f6, there's no king e6. And basically here is where the waiting technique comes into play. If white plays here, you just wait. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. White can do nothing. Like white can try to trade rooks, but it's hard to do because there's no square. First of all, if white checks you, you come up. That doesn't hurt you at all, right? If white tries to trade rooks here, what do? And this is where knowing your basic king and pawn endgames comes into play. Because if a rook trade is threatened in a rook endgame, you have to know whether it's a draw. So for example, after rook takes g6, do you guys know whether that's a draw or not? Yeah. The king comes up. And yeah, this endgame is a very simple draw. Probably most of you have seen this. The key is to go here, of course. And yeah, e7. The key is you get this position, white to move. They draw. So that doesn't help. But that's very important, right? Otherwise, your rook could get chased away. But as it is, your rook literally can't chase away. So eventually, white has to play this move. Now, what do? And this is very important. The most important move you've played so far.
B5.
If you check on b5, I play king f6, and now you're in big trouble because I'm threatening mate, and your rook can't check me. Right? My king is shielded from checks. And here, actually, you can basically resign because I'm threatening mates. And if you try to move here or here, I'll just check you. And once you get something like this, with the rook and pawn both covering the queening square, like the pawn threatening the queen, the rook covering the queening square, even if the rook were far away, it's almost always a win. Because the king can even approach the rook, and I'm just going to queen because you can't cover this square with 2 pieces. You guys see that? And here, it's very simple because the rook comes here, king comes here, you're done with checks. So that would be pretty sad, right? But the question is, why did you play this move which provokes white to push the pawn? Why would you do something like this? There's a very good reason, but you have to figure out what it is. So why would you provoke this pawn to push? There's actually a reason why the pawn on e6 is actually not very good. You're probably not going to take it.
Attack the rook.
Your king is actually very good where it is. However, your rook is actually not very good now, right? White's threatening to play king f6, so you need a move which deals with this threat.
You go down. You bring the rook down so they no longer have the shield.
Very good. So this is the whole point. You provoke the pawn to this square. And this is, again, something that happens in the endgame a lot, in the middle game almost never, which is that you move your rook back and forth to provoke one move. But why is the pawn here so important for black? What does the pawn do here, which is actually, it looks kind of silly, you're provoking a pawn forward. But this actually happens a lot. Sometimes having a pawn farther advanced is not necessarily better for that side. In this case, having the pawn here kills a very important part of White's position. What does White's king not have now? There's no shelter. In this position, if you had immediately started checking, as we saw, the king can hide here, right? If you try to be sneaky and go behind, or sorry, if you try to just wait, for example, I'm not going to come here and let you check me, but I'll play here. Now, if you check me from the side, I have the pawn push. If you check me from here, I have this move. And now your king's got to move, right? But if you start with cutting me off on the 6th rank, eventually I have to push my pawn, because otherwise I can't break through. And now your rook comes back, and now my king has no shelter from the checks. Your rook can shield from behind, but you can just trade rooks and go to a drawn king and pawn endgame. So there's no way for me to just stop endless checks until the king goes way away from the pawn. So you see what I mean? Shelter from checks is one of the most, by far the most important things to remember from these endgames. If the king does not have shelter from checks, if the king has to move far away from wherever the pawn is, wherever the action is, it's almost for sure it's going to be a draw. Just because, I mean, the pawn needs the support of the king to queen, right? So you guys understand this one? The Philidor Draw. I'd say this and Lucina positions are the two most important positions in all of Rook endgames. So if you can learn those positions, know them cold, that will help you figure out tougher positions. But I'd say these are two of the most common Rook endgame positions. Like, if you play long enough, you will get these positions eventually for both sides. So it's important to know them cold, because the thing is, if you don't know them that well, it's harder to evaluate from going into them. Like, for example, say you'll have a position where you can trade a pair of pawns or trade a pair of pieces, and you're like, okay, is this Rook endgame a draw or a win? What's going on? And it's very important that you're able to know them ahead of time, because it's hard to calculate this stuff out, right? It's a lot of moves. I mean, think about it. Each of these things is like, 10 moves, right? So it's hard to calculate it all out. But if you know going in what the result's going to be, you can evaluate what you're going to do earlier a lot easier. So it's actually, and not only that, it helps you figure out more complicated Rook endgames. I mean, it's just a really useful tool, but it's like the base. Like, you have to have, if you don't have this knowledge, it's going to be harder to acquire other types of knowledge in Rook endgames. So these are the two positions I'd say by far the most important. So moving on a little bit. So this is one of the key positions. So this is where the passivity thing comes into play. So White's threatening Rook what? I almost gave it away, but you guys can say it anyway. Rook c8 mates. Pretty strong threat, right? So Black has to play Rook back to a8. Now this is an example of the passive Rook. The reason this Rook is passive is because it just has to sit on the 8th rank. There's nothing else this Rook can do, right? And passive rooks, passive rooks in Rook endgames almost always death. There are exceptions, but for the most part, if a Rook just has to sit there, never try to check the king, never do anything, almost certainly you're not going to be able to win. Now again, think about it this way. If the Rook were behind here and were Black to move, Black could just keep giving checks, right? But because the Rook is stuck passive, it's actually a very easy win. However, there's one maneuver you got to figure out as White. So see what you can do.
Rook to e7.
Do you have a threat?
No.
So I'm just going to sit. Rook back and forth is my plan. Not a very sophisticated plan or fun plan, but that's my plan.
You have to get the rook on the other side.
Aha, you got to get the rook on the other side of the king.
So rook G7.
So you check first. If you play rook h7, then I can play rook here and pin your pawn. So it doesn't quite work out. But if you throw in this check first, it's a very clever check. I have to go here. Going here doesn't really make any difference because you're going to play rook h7 anyway. And now you're threatening mate. If the king runs, you just win the rook. If the king goes here, you play what?
Slick.
Game over, right? So passive defense, complete fail, right? That was 3 moves. That was a lot easier than building a bridge, right? At least in the building the bridge, the defensive rook is active, checking you. Passive rook gets slaughtered immediately. There are exceptions, though, which are important to know. This position, you cannot win. Rook comes back, nothing you can do. The reason why, actually, why don't you guys tell me? Why would this not be a win, but the f-pawn is? Incidentally, you'll find this is often the case. F through C are all very similar. The same rules tend to apply. G-pawns tend to be very trickier, and H-pawns, of course, tend to be extremely drawish. We'll get to that in a bit. H-pawns are by far the most drawish. But what I mean by that is, like, okay, the game's really likely to end in a draw unless you have some huge advantage, like the king's cut off by like 1,000,000 files, basically. We'll get to that in a little bit, but for now, G-pawns and B-pawns are actually very tricky, I'd say. They're the trickiest pawns to learn. But in this particular case, it helps black, because there's no way to win. Why do you think that is? What's one measly file? Do you remember the winning technique from before? What was the winning technique from before? All right, so try it. The problem is that you don't have enough room. You need to play rook to I7 here. But unfortunately, not quite playable. You don't want to play G7, of course, because... And now you actually lose. That would be highly embarrassing. So if you don't do that, though, there's no way to get your rook to the other side, right? So the king just sits here. The rook goes back and forth all day. Black kind of laughs. Nothing you can do. Of course, you can play it out a little bit, try some stuff, but it's actually a draw. Kind of a bummer, right? But that's the way it works. So passive defense, almost always a disaster. That's one of the exceptions, if it's a G-pawn or a B-pawn. Keep in mind, G and B are the same, right? That's the nice thing about endgames. You don't only have to learn half of the board. All right. So this next one, this is a painful position for me, and this is why. I was actually on the black side of this position against a student of mine, who I taught this endgame, and he was not able to win it. So I was sitting there at the board going like this. I was like trying not to just be like, no, please just win. Because it's like I actually showed him this, and it was like, you know, he forgot one little detail. He wasn't able to win it. So this position, you can actually force a Lucina position, and which, as we know, is the win. So you have to learn how to force it. So first of all, black can't. The funny thing is that black could even get the rook to G8, it would be a draw, right? Because it's a B pawn. See that? But there's no way to do it. If black tries rook here, it loses very simply to check. And now you just trade. Easy enough, right? So black has to try to run with the king. So once the king gets out, now here, how does white win? This is probably the toughest move to find. And this is actually, the funny thing is he actually found this move, but didn't find the move afterwards, which I thought was really strange. But so just to give you guys a little hint. So first of all, you'd like to play king a6, but the problem here, what do you think the problem with king a6 is? The pawn covered. You're close, though. Not king c6, but king where? Yeah. And the problem is now you have to start all over again. You have to play check, and then come back, and do the whole thing over again. So that doesn't help you. But basically, you want to get your king here and pawn here, right? The problem you have is that if you move your rook here to defend your pawn, the king will slide in front. If you try to go to the side, the king will come over. So you need to use a very sneaky maneuver here in order to win. If rook h4, I'll still play here. Remember, if the king gets too close, you're probably not going to be able to do it. It's a really weird looking move. So if you're looking for moves and you see one, you're like, oh, that can't be right, that's probably the move. Rook a8 looks like a reasonable try. What happens if I play here and just sit? Remember, you always have to consider, what am I going to do if my opponent sits? For both sides, actually. So it's a common thing in the endgame. You can, but again, the king's going to run here the second you move. You could try something like this. But then here, and the rook can't move, I mean, it's kind of not really working out for you, right? I think eventually he did that, and that's how we drew, but OK. It's actually rook b8. That's a hard move to find, right? But try to figure out the purpose. So first of all, if the rook moves anywhere along here, like say rook a1, now you can play what? Again, your goal is to get the pawn to b7. So how do you do that? If you play king c5, again, remember the checks, right? b7. And you're going to play pawn here, rook over, king here, pawn here. Right? So I decided to try what I thought was the best practical attempt. I played here, or just kept the rook on the file. But what option did you give yourself? Now that you played rook b8, what move do you have here, which was not an option before? King a6, then king c7 again. And it's the same problem. But you found an extra square for yourself by playing rook b8. And this is the move. For some reason, he just blanked on this move. I mean, it happens to very strong players. It's not that surprising, but. Rook b7, then the king again will go to c8. It's the same problem. Again, your goal is to push the pawn, so you want to get your king out of the way. But king b7 doesn't work. King a6, then king c7. So what move do you play? Ha. And this was the move that he forgot. The whole point is that now if I check from the side, you play to b7 and you win the same way. Get your pawn to b6. Once you get your pawn to b6, it's easy to advance it the rest of the way, because you're actually very well shielded. So here, yeah, and here there's nothing you can do. So king a7, if king c7, you give this check. It's a very important move to have as well. So you see how this rook looked really weird, but somehow it actually turned out to be very useful. So then the king would move, and now you can just move the rook over, and you're actually going to get the exact Lucina position. So just to test you guys, because I'm not a nice person. How do you guys win?
Wait, we know this.
Oh, yeah.
We know this, guys. Come on.
You got it down. The first time I showed you, you nailed it. What's the technique you use? Building what? A bridge, right? Not a cannon. Not a highway. It's a bridge. So I don't even know why it's building a bridge, but that's what they call it. So what do you do first? Where do you need your rook, first of all? OK. So what do you do? So one trick to note is that the rook ever moves. Like say I play here. You can win very simply by putting your rook here and then sliding your king over. And you see how the rook shields you from checks here, and then the pawn's going to just queen. There's no defense to that. For example, if the rook goes here, you have a few ways you can do it, but you can play here and then give this check and then get a queen. Or if you want to be fancy about it, you can even get a queen here and then check. Yeah, if you want to be fancy.
Do that.
Not necessary, but it's kind of nice because it's all checks.
And the face.
But okay. So say instead I just sit. Rook d4 check. So if king c6, got this one, right? So I'm going to play king here. And now. c7. So if I play king e5, you can just go here, and that's the easiest way. Rook here also wins. So okay, I'm going to give a check. Mm-hmm. So if I give a check, you come here, right? If I go rook here. I'm not. I never advertise myself as such, so I don't feel like I'm betraying any expectations. Yeah, I mean, there are a few ways to win. You could even play like rook c4, king c7. But yeah, rook d5 is the nicest, because now you're just going to shield. Very nice. Good job. You succeeded where my 2200 student failed. Not joking. So you guys are experts already. All right. Yeah, it was actually really painful because it's like at the same time I don't want to lose the game, but I also don't want him not to win it because it's like we just worked on it. So I was like, oh. But anyway, yeah, it was tough. But this is the tricky maneuver, right? Rook b8 and king a7, not obvious. But you see how it's much easier to find if you know what you're aiming for. Once you know the Lucina, you don't have to worry about winning that position. You just have to worry about getting to it. Once you get there, you'll be able to win it. You might have to spend a couple minutes. I'm not saying you have to blitz it out. But you might have to spend a few minutes, but at least you'll know it's a win. You'll know you're there. It might take a while. I mean, it's hard to recognize all these positions right away. But the way you were able to get there is a little bit tricky. But once you knew what you were aiming for, it makes it a lot easier to find. So the next one, so this one is actually really pretty tricky. So with white to move, if you use this technique, it's actually a draw with best play. But this is very tricky stuff. So first of all, what is it black going to play? If it were black's move, what would black play?
G6.
Rook g6, right? And you cut off the sixth, and if the pawn pushes, then you go back, right?
Yep.
Go back, check endlessly. But it's white's move. So you're white. So again, even if you know it's a draw, you always want to make your opponent prove it. You want to make them find as many good moves as possible. So say you're white here. It's still a draw. Like let's say you knew it. You know your Rook Endgame's cold. You're like, yeah, I got this. But you know it's a draw, but you still want to challenge them. So how do you challenge them the most? And trust me, almost all of your opponents will not know this, and you will probably win. So,
That's what I'm looking for.
yeah. So what's the most challenging move? I showed you this technique before, but it was a slightly different position. I like to mix the pawn around, by the way, just because people get too used to doing it on one side of the board, and then they get to the other side of the board, they're like, whoa, what's going on? Even though it's the same. So I like to move the pawn around just to confuse you guys. Again, never said I was a nice person. So king c6 is possible, but the problem is that there's rook check. And the king has to move back, and you put the rook where it wants to go, right? So you have to be a little bit more subtle.
King b6.
Aha. So the threat now, so the threat now is to give check, right? So believe it or not, so here it already gets kind of tricky. The best defense is actually not to check, but to put the rook behind the pawn. The reason being that now if white gives a check here, the king comes up and you can't really do much. You can't push the pawn. Black's threatening to check the king to the a file, which is certainly going to be a draw. So really, white would just have to go back. Rook check here, king goes here, doesn't do anything. But white's whole idea was to provoke the rook to go behind the pawn in order to play this move. So white says, ha ha ha. But now compare this to the b pawn position. In the b pawn position, the king had to go out here, right? So one of the problems with the king out there, so for example, if the king goes this way, and you do this maneuver, this is actually a win. The reason being is that this king will block checks. If the rook tries to check from the side, the king will block it. So one of the main things to remember in this position, this is again one of the most important positions you can face here, go to the short side. The short side meaning the edge of the board. It looks a little weird at first, but the main idea is that you need a place to check from. So remember, a lot of the positions that determining whether they're wins or draws is by whether they have the king has shelter from rook checks. So if your own king can actually be a hindrance because it blocks your rook from giving checks. So compare this king d8 to going to the short side. So let's say black tries the same maneuver. So if black just plays like rook d8, rook here, you just sit. If the rook ever comes up, you play king back, right? So white tries this one. But now, and look at all these lovely files you have to check from. And they're open. You don't have a king here blocking your rook. And that's what makes the difference. So this position is actually just a draw. Because you can check endlessly from the side, but there are still some tricks. Not that many. I mean, for example, if the rook comes here, you don't want to give checks, because then the king will come up. Believe it or not, that's still a draw, but you have to be more precise. We're not really going to get into that. But you can simply bring the rook back. If the king ever moves here, you come here. But the main thing to remember is that the second white threatens king d7, you slide your rook over and check from the side. Does that make sense to you guys? All right. So I'm going to show you one more, which is kind of a cool one to show. And then I'm going to give you a few problems where you actually have to use the knowledge that you've acquired and mastered thus far. So the a pawn. So I wanted to talk about it a little so you guys wouldn't go play a game and then you're like, wait, but he never even mentioned an a pawn or a rook pawn. So rook pawns are so hard to win with because it's hard to find shelter because the king can't even move to the side of the board, right? So the king, it's so much like you get a position like this and the rook cuts off the king completely. The king can't even move. So in order to win, so for example, white would never play this move, but let's say you had this. Even here, with the king cut off 4 files, you cannot win. It's amazing, but the king will simply sit, and if you try to bring your rook around, once the king gets here, you have no hope because the king just never lets this king out. So for example, rook here, you just play rook here, and then the rook will just sit, and you just do this forever, and white cannot do anything. If white tries to check you from the side, you just say nope, and this king is never getting out, basically. So, white can check you forever, but you're just never letting go, and there's no hope. So then eventually white will play here and give up. Just for fun. So, just for fun. This actually happened in a game of mine, believe it or not. My opponent did that at the end, just for kicks. He did it with a smile on his face. But in this position, you need 5 files, and this is enough to win. And it's with a really cool sequence. So this is how it goes. Rook comes to the side. Rook here. So you need to put the rook here is the key. Trying to go to b7 doesn't quite work. Because if you go to b7, I come out and you can't bring your king out. Because checkmate. Embarrassing, right? It's easy to get embarrassed in these positions, let me tell you. So rook h8. The king tries to come closer. So if the king comes here, it's actually rather straightforward. Because you play rook here, the king gets out, and now, how do you win? I keep giving checks, but where can your king run? This is one of the cases where the king can actually go far away from the rook and pawn. Because, do you remember this pattern with the pawn and rook here, or the rook covering the 8th and the pawn ready to queen? So all I need is to get one move to queen my pawn, and even if your rook guards it, I just win a rook, right? So the king can just run out this way. And okay, you can keep giving checks, but eventually I will chase your rook down, right? That was that. However, black can be much more annoying, which of course I'm going to be, and play this move. So you can try the same move. So it doesn't really matter where the rook moves that much. The king gets out. But now coming out this way doesn't work. You don't have enough space, because this king guards this square. So if you try to come out this way, you just can't do it, because the rook has to guard the pawn. And once again, if the king tries to come out here, you see how you just lose the pawn? So the only way to try to do it is to go this way, which looks easy enough. You go here, rook here, and you're like, what's the big deal, right? The king's sheltered, right? But now I play here threatening mate. Believe it or not, this isn't so simple. So, incidentally, if the rook tries to go here, it doesn't really work out, because I play king here. And after check, you don't quite have enough room. But if I go all the way to the edge of the board, you can't go out this way. Because in this position, what do? The rook's hanging, right? The pawn's ready to queen. You only have one chance.
Check it.
Yeah. And then you can take the pawn. So you can't escape this way. So the only try is to check the king. I play here. And this is the really cool part. So the problem you have is if you try to go here, then I'm going to give you checks. So for example, here, check. And you can't come out here, because I'll check here. So you have to go here, check, approach my rook. And now I'll come here. And if here, then I come here, and you're too far away. I force the rook back. And now you're going to lose this pawn. See that? So you have to be a bit more clever. So what move do you think you have here? It's actually a really cool move. Very nice. So if king takes rook, you queen with check. You should be able to check and win this rook, I'm pretty sure. But even if not, OK, you have queen against rook. It's another story entirely. But it is a win. And the nice thing here, so if the rook king goes here, now you can come back. And the difference is you have an escape route. So for example, if I check, you can come here. And if I try to check you this way, you can run away like this. And if I go here, now you can actually castle, sort of. You play rook here. Got to check, yep. But now, once again, your king has shelter. Your king has extra space. And it's over. You're just going to get a queen next. That wasn't complicated at all, right? But you see how crazy these get? Even with the rook king cut off 5 files, you have to be this precise in order to win.